she's going to have her own introduction, so I'm just going to leave it to Angela Roell.
Hey, folks. Cool. Thanks for having me. So, like Ed said, definitely I can get going and not stop. And I want to make sure that we have lunch, so if you're really hungry, just scowl at me. No, I'm just kidding. I'll make sure we'll find a good stopping point, because it looks like we'd stop pretty late on this agenda, so we might just shift things a little bit around. So welcome, thank you for coming. My name is Angela Roell, as Ed said. I run a small apiary and queen rearing operation out in Western Mass, in Montague, which is most famous for the Montague Book Mill, which you can't find. Books you don't need in a place you can't find. I've been keeping bees since 2010, and I've been raising queens for the last 3.5 years. And last year I had the opportunity to go up and study with Kirk Webster for 10 days, and it was really powerful, and it changed everything about my beekeeping. It really got me thinking a lot about systems and management. When you're raising 50 or 100 queens at a time, systems become really important, but I also think systems of practice are really important when you're raising 3 hives or caring for 10 hives. And so a lot of what we're going to do today is think about how to manage using systems and really plan for how we're going to manage our bees. One of the things that Kirk says is to design your systems and then figure out what compromises you're willing to make. And so we'll talk through what that is and what that looks like for each of us today. So I want to start out by just getting a sense of where we're at and how long folks have been keeping bees. And so what I'd love to do is just a quick round of introductions. And you can talk to me, or you can tell us your name, how long you've been keeping bees, maybe how many hives you have, what your favorite bee to run is, like what type of bee you like to work with the most. Does that sound good for everyone? Do we want to stand up and do a circle, or do we want to stay in our seats because it's Saturday morning and we're tired?
Pop-ups.
Pop-ups? Yeah, I like that. I like that. All right, let's do pop-ups. So like I said, Angela Roell, I've been at this for about 7 years, pretty voraciously. I love running Russian bees, which is ironic because I'm Ukrainian and we historically do not have a good compatibility. I've also been running these new VSH bees from Mike Palmer by way of Sam Comfort that I was really impressed with how they came through the winter. And so I'm suddenly surprised and maybe shifting the type of bee that I love to run the most. Can we start at this table?
Jim Lifton, keeping bees for 4 years. 24 hives, 2 apiaries, 1 Sherborne, 1 Plymouth, and I have Buckfast hybrids, Italian mutts, Carolians, which I think are my favorite. They seem to be most compatible. They do the winter well.
Thanks, Jim.
I'm Glenn Bird. I've got 4 hives. I've been running bees for 25 to 30 years, and it'd be nice to learn a little bit more about it. I'm not even sure what kind of bees I have. It's a good hobby.
I'm Mary Szymanski. We've been keeping bees for almost 10 years, I guess. 9. And we have, I guess it's sort of a mixture. I guess they're kind of mutts, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so this is 9 years. Yeah, we have mutts, but they're based on a Buckfast hybrid that originated with Mike Palmer too, and those are my favorites. But I've been very impressed at how they overwintered.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're kind of mixing things up in our yard, and we want to add some VSH genetics too, and that's otherwise what she said.
Cool. Hi.
I'm Deb Spielman. I'm a brand new beekeeper. I've overwintered. I have 1 hive. I have no clue what they are, and I slipped into the class yesterday because there was an opening. So
Great.
Happy to be here.
Welcome.
Hi, I'm Gigi Turgeon. I'm in North Mass. I started in 2008. Back then, I got lucky and I thought I was smart. And now I realize there's so much to continue to learn. I've had a variety of different bees that I've enjoyed. I had Russians and they were so mean. I ran into problems. And I went up to Dan Connell's Queen seminar and met our lovely speaker. And Dan's got the most gentle Russians. They were so beautiful. I fell in love with them there. They were different than what I had.
They're like people, you know, really, really wide variety falling under one umbrella.
Dan must bring the best out of it.
I'm Hal. I've been having bees since 2010. Right now, 4 hives. I run anywhere from 10 to 4.
Cool, thank you.
Buckfast hybrid.
Dwayne Rice, Walpole. 30 years ago, I had 8 hives of bees, and I was president of the Norfolk County Beekeepers Association. And we had a bee school like we just graduated from. We had 16 in the bee school, 16. And what did we have this year, 130?
Well,
Wow.
65, I think, yeah.
So it has certainly
Awesome.
changed.
That's great.
Everything I did 30 years ago with 8 hives of bees seems to be gone. I am shocked at how it's changed. Everything is different. We had a feeder on the front with a board. I don't remember what you call that feeder. And today I see all the different feeders and everything. I'm all confused. My bees arrived April 27th, and I don't know what I'm going to use to feed them. There are so many different things you can use. And I have no idea what my queen is going to be, but she's coming to Walpole April 27th.
Good morning, I'm Mary McMahon. I went into winter with 2 colonies, one from a package and one from a nuke of Buckfast. The Buckfast survived, which is sort of good news, except that I find them really aggressive. But have had other conversations with people that suggest that maybe it's just my kid's ornery or something.
They're hungry.
So at the moment I have 1 colony, but we'll be increasing to 2 for this year. And this, I'm going into my 4th year.
You guys don't like mean bees? You don't like getting chased 30 feet?
30 feet, that's nothing.
So I'm Pam Cubbins, and I'm here with Paul Criswell, my husband, and we're here because of our son, Trevor Criswell, who really wants to beekeep. He lives in Cambridge, we live in Wellesley, and we have a piece of property that we organic garden for over 30 years. And he has chosen our property for his bees, which are arriving on the 21st in a week. And they're Italians, and they're coming from Georgia via, I guess, Rhode Island. And so my son has been busily getting everything ready. We've all been attending classes. This is an incredible group of people who we find, I mean, we've learned so much so far, and I'm really kind of scared, quite frankly, about getting these bees. We have a mentor set up. And thank you for this Beekeeping Association who, disseminates information in such a generous way. And we're looking forward to today, even though we're newbies. And I'm of Ukrainian descent, by the way, and I would never have Russian bees.
Hey,
Sorry, I hate to say it. I'm kidding. I'm joking.
No, I get it.
Yeah, and
My seamstress is Ukrainian. Russian. We fight all the time.
I know,
Yeah,
believe me,
it's
I
insane.
know, I know the whole thing. But also, I didn't recognize Ed with his haircut.
Me neither.
I was like, what's that? In front of it. Anyway, thank you for today.
Hi, I'm John Connie from Canton. I started with 1 hive 2 years ago, so I'm going into my 3rd year. And the hive did great the first year. It swarmed on me, it was going crazy, but it died out like early spring last year. So I started over with another package, and then I split that, so now I have 2 hives presently, and they're doing awesome this year, which is really good to see. Out in the yard, going crazy, bringing tons of pollen back every day. So off to the start of my 3rd year, and looking forward to maybe trying to raise some queens. I'm interested in getting some new hygienics. The Nook hive that I started, I got a Buckfast queen from Kathy, who had some imported last year from Canada, and that hive is doing good. They are gentle. I don't notice any difference in my Buckfast compared to the Italian. They both seem like they're gentle in nature. So just looking forward to a good year and finally getting a bumper crop of honey and expanding the apiary. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jack McDowell from Norton, and I'm a newbie. I just graduated from Norfolk School, and I'm still expecting my hive to come in the first week of May.
Great.
So I'm just trying to learn as much as possible.
I'm Curtis Best from Hopkinton. Right now, my wife and I have 2 hives, and this is going into our 4th season. We've been to a lot of classes, read a lot of books, taken a lot of notes, and I really do appreciate what the club here has done. It's been a great experience, but we're still waiting to achieve that sense of certainty.
So are the rest of us.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. But that's what we're hoping to achieve. And again, just to mirror your comments, I appreciate the clubs doing so much for education.
When you find it, let us know.
Yep. You could bring that back to us, that'd be great.
Yeah.
My name is Ken Pearl. I'm from Marshfield. I've been keeping bees over 5 years now. 16 hives. Basically connies and ankle biters. But I did get one of Kathy's Buckfast last year, and that hive is doing fantastic. Very well. You don't find them overly aggressive at all, and can work them barehanded. Probably working without a veil and everything else too. So these are not very, very, very gentle bees. I work with Bob raising queens, so got a lot of experience doing that. So just want to keep learning more. So
Cool.
Never learn enough.
Hi, I'm Bob Hickey. I think I've been doing bees for about 12 years. Got a variety of bees in the apiary, connies, ankle biters, Italians. Got 17 hives alive as of yesterday and 4 nukes. I don't do any honey actually. I'm more involved in trying to improve the genetic traits of the bees in the local area. We raise queens, and I teach queen rearing with Kenny. And every year I realize I think I know something and I don't. It's a challenge every year, and I just love it. You just don't know what's around the corner with beekeeping, and it's a very humbling hobby.
Mary Chmielewski. I have 2 hives. Queen Mary survived along with the queen, but Queen Elizabeth is dead. And so we're replacing her with an Italian from Georgia through Todd Barker this year. And I'm looking to actually expand to a 3rd hive. I've enjoyed it absolutely thoroughly, and I can't thank you enough for having this format for us to learn in. So I'm looking for a 3rd hive. I started way too late looking for a nuke and haven't been able to find one. So if anybody has one that they're interested in, I'm also interested in carnelian bees and buckfast bees. So thank you.
I am Jan Cormier from Milton. I started beekeeping about 3 years ago. Last winter, the bees didn't make it. My hive had swarmed, and let the hive requeen itself, and that queen never really generated a lot of brood, and ended up not making it through the winter. So I'm repopulating, starting a new hive this year. So I'm hoping to have that luck.
Was that an egg swarm?
Excuse me?
Was that an egg swarm?
No, it was a spring swarm, and my mom had health issues, so I was dealing with her coming to live with us and things like that. So I was like, things had to be put on the back burner. So I feel like I'm going to take care of themselves, and they just didn't make it. And the mites were really, really bad. So I know definitely it was.
We should talk at the break, because I have hives in Milton, and there was a hive bomb on the property. I discovered it. So we'll talk at the break.
What's a hive? Okay.
We'll tell you at the break.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Kitty DeGroot from Marion. I've been keeping bees for about 6 years. The first 3 years in Florida with the Africanized then the last 3 years up here in New England. Spent the last 3 years trying to figure out what is overwintering. I have 19 hives now, and hoping to start queen rearing this year. First time.
I moved here from Florida, and I'm still trying to figure out what is overwintering.
I'm Suzanne Treesick. I'm from Medway. I went into the winter with a nuke and 2 hives, and I only have 1 hive, and I'm very sad. But the hive that I have, I've had for 4 years. I've been doing it for 4 years. This is a tough hive. It's an angry hive, but it made it through the winter, so at least I have 1.
I'm Jeannie Smith from Mattapoisett, and I've been doing this for about 7 years. The first 5 were just repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And then I joined Norfolk, and I heard Erin's class on re-queening in the summer, and all my hives lived this year, which was sort of amazing.
Hi, I'm Paul Criswell. I'm from Wellesley. As Pam said, our son dragged her into this, and then she in turn dragged me into this. So I figure I better figure out what's going on here. And as of next Saturday, the Hotel Budapest will open in our backyard. And we've got another one. It's my son's clever names, and I forget what the other one is, but I'm here to try to just kind of hang on.
I'm Brian. I've been doing beekeeping for 3 years. I started 3 years ago with the Norfolk class. Started with 1 hive, made it through the first winter. Last year it swarmed. We captured the swarm, so we had 2 hives. And then both hives are weak, so we combined them going into this winter, and it didn't last the winter. We kind of suspected that because it was going to the winter week, so starting new this year.
I'm Barbara Farrington. I'm from Medway too. Been beekeeping for just 2 years, realizing how much I need to learn and how much I want to learn. Went into winter with 2 hives. I think I'm going to lose 1. I'll be checking it out later today. But it's a fascinating hobby.
I'm Glenda Hazard. I've been through 2 winters with bees. One went better than the other. I started out with Italians.
How do you think that's going to work?
Now I guess I have what you call an ethnically diverse hive. And hopefully, I'm hoping to expand to 3 hives. At the moment I have 2. I'm looking forward to trying some new types and seeing how they do.
I'm Kim Demers from Uxbridge. I've been beekeeping for 7 years now and run anywhere between 4 and 6 hives. I have 4 right now. We lost 1 going through this winter. And as Linda does, my bees are pretty much mutts. I don't try to do one type or the other. I just let them raise their queens when they need to and see what happens. So.
Great. All right, teach me something. What is an ankle biter bee?
That was the Purdue.
Oh, yeah.
They bite the legs off the mites.
Interesting. And they called them ankle biters.
Purdue ankle biters.
Purdue. I remember reading about those now. Yeah. Okay. Nice. Cool. So we've got quite a variance of experience. So one of the things that I wanted to start out with is a quick review, just to get us all sort of on the same page and to wake us up. So I'm going to ask you some questions. All right. So tell me what these are. Don't say honeybees. All right, so we have a queen, a worker, and a drone. We know what the queen's job is. She's here for those of us that are early starters. What's the worker's job? Trick question. Okay, so a worker starts out as a nurse bee. She then becomes a forager and shifts to a guard, right? We're all on the same page with that. Drone's job? Exploding penis. Great, so when we think about hive health, 2 things that I always try to stress with hive health is that the health of your queen greatly impacts the hive's health. I heard a couple of you talk about Erin and requeening in the summertime. So we'll talk a little about requeening today, but we're also going to talk about sort of how to analyze that queen's health and figure out which queens are the best queens from which to rear. One thing that my friend Tucka says frequently is that we learn about bees by killing them. So I think it's important to be forgiving of ourselves when we are learning how to rear queens, and to recognize that we're going to probably make a lot of mistakes, and that's okay. Because if anyone has been keeping bees for more than 1 year, you know that you've already made a lot of mistakes. And then the other really important thing I want to talk about when I'm thinking about drones or mating in particular is that you absolutely have to have drones present in order to have a reproductive cycle. And they not only have to be present, but they have to be sexually mature. So 2 things to hold in your mind: that you're looking at your queen and using the queen as an indicator of hive health, and then that you are making sure that not only do you have drones, but that they are sexually mature enough to mate with the queens that you're going to have emerging. Okay, so this isn't actually the life cycle. This is the pupation cycle of the honeybee, and I like to refer to this as bee math. I think it is absolutely crucial if you are thinking at all about rearing queens or even making splits, that you have an understanding of this. And not only do I think it's important for folks who are thinking about making splits and rearing queens, I think that this is an important thing to know so that you understand what the heck is going on inside of your hive. So if you look at your hive and you have 3 frames of capped brood, that should tell you that in the next few days, you're going to have 6 frames of fully emerged nurse bees, right? So when you know that, you can then make decisions about when the best time to make a split is, or how big your hive is going to get in the next week, or 2 weeks, or 3 weeks. And when you have an understanding of that basic bee math, that pupation cycle of your worker and of your drone, you're able to have a lot more, I won't call it control, but I will call it, you're able to make manipulations a lot more easily, right? If you don't have an understanding of what's going on and you're making wild guesses as to when your hive might be ready for a split, or when your drones might be sexually mature, you are going to get into a situation where you are oversimplifying a very complex biological system. So one thing I really try to stress, especially when I'm working with beekeepers who've only been beekeeping for a few years, is that this is a complex biological system, and you have to have an understanding of what's going on in the system. And the more you know about the system, the less randomized guessing you're going to be doing. And we live in New England, so if we lived in Florida, we'd all be a lot warmer right now, and we would have to deal with many more complex issues. But we would have a lot more room making mistakes, right? There's a constant cycle of both flows and healthy bee weather in Florida. And so when you're keeping bees in Florida, you can make a lot of mistakes and make up for your mistakes quickly. You can reproduce your hives over the course of certain flows, and you can produce honey, and you can raise queens, and you can mess up, and you can learn. But when you live in New England, that time frame in which you have to raise queens and produce honey is really only about 6 or 8 weeks. And so you don't have room for error. So it's kind of like you have to take the New England, or what do they call us up here? The Yankee mindset, and apply that to your beekeeping, right? You're stacking wood in May. You're thinking about what's going to happen in winter in August. You have to do that with beekeeping too. This isn't just like apply whatever practice you kind of read about in a book and remember once. Practice here in New England. It really is something that you have to be diligent about and you have to plan for in order to execute things. So let's look at our math. So our workers incubate for 21 days and then they emerge, so that's 3 weeks. The drones incubate a couple days longer, 24 days, and then it takes 10 extra days for them to be sexually mature. So for 10 days, they are hanging out, eating honey, flying around, being kind of dopey and cute and stuff, and then they are ready to copulate with our queen. So this is basic bee math. And Mike Palmer talks a lot about this, and he is the one that really drilled this down into my head. We need to understand this if we are raising queens, if we are making splits, if we are doing hive swarm management in any way, so that we can make sure that we're managing our hives properly, right? At the peak of swarm season, you should be inspecting your hive, or at least know what's going on in your hive every 12 to 13 days so you don't end up with a fully mature queen cell, okay? So that's one step, one really important thing. When you have 6 frames of worker brood, that means that you need to add an additional box to that hive, because you're going to have 12 frames of workers emerging in, or capped worker brood. You're going to have 12 frames of workers emerging in the next few days, and if you only have 1 box on that hive, that's going to be an overpacked hive, and they're going to start swarm response. So it's important to understand this basic math so that you can make basically all of the decisions in your apiary. Oh, we've got a little bit of, oh yeah, I did all these animations. Fun. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about hive health, and I think I have something in here about mites, but I didn't go too much into detail about, I will soapbox all about what I think about mites and the importance of counting for mites, and why I think that that's important, and the intersection of that and treatments versus not treatments. But I'm not going to go deep into my mite lecture, because I know that you're doing something in quite a bit of depth, right? Is that correct? Okay, so we'll talk about strength, we'll talk about viability, we'll talk about mites, but I'm not going to sort of overload you with mite lecture, because you're going to get that. So we all have various ways to manage for pests and disease load. It's important to track our pest pressure so that we can ensure that we are breeding from healthy hives. So you don't want to take a hive that is full of mites and split it into a bunch of smaller hives, because now you just have 5 small hives that are full of mites instead of 1 big hive that is full of mites. And so in order to make decisions about, in order to breed, you need to understand the mite counts that are in your hives so you can make decisions about how to manage your hives. So when I talk about the importance of tracking pests, there's 3 different ways that we check for mites. We do mite washes, which is an alcohol wash, and the mite rolls, which is the same thing, and then mite drops, which is where you put the sticky board underneath your hive, and you let the mites drop down over a 24-hour period, and then you count the mites. I don't do mite drops, I do mite washes and rolls. I do not think, even though in the Bee Source handout it says that you can use powdered sugar, I don't think that we in New England can use powdered sugar for mite washes. And the reason I don't think it is because it is too hot and swampy here in the summer, and I had a really disastrous season a couple years ago where I assumed that my mite counts were low based on my powdered sugar rolls. And then I ended up losing a whole yard of bees, which was about 25 hives, because the rolls weren't accurate. And the reason that I know that is because I had someone from MDAR come out and do washes later in the season, and they didn't return the results to me until the winter time. And the wash counts versus my roll counts were significantly different. And so I was going through assuming that my hives were healthy and that they didn't need a treatment, so I didn't apply treatment to that entire apiary yard, and I lost that whole yard. So now my new soapbox is there is no way that you can use this powdered sugar here in New England. I think that if you live in a place that's dry, you could maybe use it, but I don't think that it gets enough of the mites dislodged from our bees at this point in order for us to make those informed decisions. So I know that mite washes kill bees, right? You have to take an alcohol sample, you got to dump them into a cup of alcohol and swirl them around, and that kills bees. But what kills more bees is when you lose a whole yard to mites. We are at a point with mites where they are able to really lodge within the exoskeleton of our honeybees, and it's been proven through the Bee-Informed Partnership that they're actually feeding on the lymphatic system. So they're not just sucking the blood of our honeybees, right? So it's not like a tick that attaches to us. They're actually feeding on the lymphatic system, which is their immune system, okay? So if you think about having a parasite attached to your immune system, I have an autoimmune disease. And part of having an autoimmune disease is that exact thing, that I essentially have an immune system that sometimes takes these huge dives. And I know from having that autoimmune disease that when I'm having a dive in my autoimmune function, I feel terrible. Like, it feels like I am at least 25 years older than I am. My bones hurt, my joints swell, I can't walk, I can't go to work, I can't go to school. And so when I learned that the lymphatic system was the feeding system for these mites, and I compared that to my own experience, I realized how dire the situation is, right? And so I'll talk about treatment versus non-treatment, but I really think it's important for us to, at the bare minimum, whatever our management system is going to be, understand what the pressure of mites is inside of our hive. So we want to have an understanding of what's going on in there and be able to make informed decisions from that, rather than, oh, I think it's fine because I don't see any mites, right? I hear that all the time from beginning beekeepers. I didn't treat because I didn't see any mites. I'm like, oh, cool, yeah. Did you take every bee out of the hive, turn it over, and look at it with a magnifying glass? Because these things are lodged underneath them in their exoskeletons. They have adapted to the ways that we treat. They have adapted to the methods by which we inspect. These guys are sneaky little buggers. And so we really need to be counting and tracking pest pressure so we can make those informed decisions. And otherwise, we are just breeding and breeding and breeding mites. We're not breeding bees. We're breeding mites, which is gross. You've seen them, right? They're super gross. Okay. So how I do this is I manage mite counts in the spring, summer, and the fall. So I'm aware of the pest pressure in my hives throughout the year. And I never breed from a hive, even if it had a banging over winter. I don't breed from a hive until I've had it for a full year cycle. So I know what its pest pressure is in spring, summer, and fall, and I can make informed decisions about that hive in the following year. The other big soapbox for me that I think it's important for beekeepers to get on board with is keeping diligent records, okay? And then I say that, and then I also think it's important to say, don't create a system of record keeping that is so complex that you're standing out in the yard sticky and like covered in propolis and trying to write 300 things on a piece of paper, right? Because the paper's gonna fly away, or it's gonna get stuck to something, or you're just not going to do it, and then you're not going to keep up with it. So one of the handouts that I have for you today is a little like hive health book. I don't know where the actual origin of this was, but it's a really, really simple book. And if you don't have one now, you can grab one at the break. It's not a big deal. But it's basically, you know, your hive number, the amount of honey, the number of frames, full frames of brood, and then any problems, treatments, or notes, and then a star, right? So I do this on the backs of my hives in a wax marker, which is something that I took from Kirk Webster. So I can keep track, and then I just go through and photograph every single hive. So I have a record of what's going on in each of the yards. And then I tell myself that in the winter, I'm gonna like take all those records and put them in a spreadsheet, and I never do that. I never do that, even though I would love to. This year I have an intern, so maybe I'll do it. But you want a system of management that allows you to understand what's going on inside of your hives, what you did last time, so you can make informed decisions. Another thing that I really took away from Kirk's management system is that he goes into his yard and makes a decision. You know, he knows what he's doing that day, and if there's anything that's going to throw him off course, he doesn't deal with it, right? So if he goes into a yard and we're making splits. So we're making splits that day, and we're splitting up hives, and in those hives that he's splitting up, he's finding queen cells. He's not like, oh, I need to like take this and put it into no, he's just culling those queen cells so that he can keep his system moving and operating in the way that makes the most sense for him. And I think one thing that we are all guilty of as beekeepers is we go in with one idea, and then we find a different idea, and we are like, oh, now I'll do this instead. And we're in there acting out things that don't need to happen to keep our system moving, because we're like, oh, I want to just make sure I save this one queen. But is that a queen from the lines that are working for you, and do you even want that queen in the first place? So you have to think about, what are the things that I want in my apiary, and how am I going to get there, and how am I going to manage and keep records so that I know I'm on track, and I have a way to hold myself accountable, rather than just like acting all willy-nilly. Again, this goes back to that, we have a 6 to 8 week window where we're producing honey and really expanding bees, and we have to be able to take advantage of that window. Otherwise, we are going to be in a space where we are losing our bees. Oh, and I said this already, that I don't use hives for reproduction unless they've survived 1 full year, so I can see the different pest pressures in a yard. I also don't tend to mate from hives in new yards. So I have my mating yards, and then if I establish a new yard, I know there's some of us who probably have several yards, so I'll speak a little bit to that. If I establish a new yard, I actually track pest pressure and performance in that yard for a full year before I do any kind of mating in it. And that's just to give me a sense of what's going on in that yard and around that yard. Out where I am, some of the issues that we run into are in pesticide use on larger commercial farms. And it's not always super clear, even though I might track 2 miles around that yard and see what's going on around it, exactly when applications of pesticides and treatments are happening on those farms. And I'm never quite sure, even if a lot of my yards are actually within about a 3 mile radius of each other, the way that the nectar flows change based on that radius and what's available is pretty significant. So I don't want to make any decisions about doing any breeding in a yard until I've had bees in that yard for a full year and I see what their performance is and I have a comparison. Okay, how did yard 2 do compared to yard 1? So this goes back to those records, and even though I am guilty of not putting them in my Excel sheet like I should, I still have those records that I can look through and be able to make informed decisions from. Okay. This is just an example of brood that I wanted to make sure I put in here. This is from a VSH hive. This is actually a queen hotel that I have from the Daunt. I really don't like it. It's kind of terrible. But I do use it in a pinch. And so I just wanted to give an example of a healthy brood, and then you can see from these little spots where they are removing and culling unhealthy brood. And then I wanted to make sure that we all saw eggs. You probably can't see them from your seats. Can you see them? Yeah? Nice. Hooray! So when I do queen breeding, most of what I do is grafting. And I'm not really going to talk about grafting today because it's quite a complex system, and it's actually, it's really a hands-on experience. I don't think that we should talk about it in an intellectual way without doing it. But when you are grafting, what you are doing is taking these day-old eggs, scooping them out with a tiny instrument, and placing them in what's called queen cups. And then you're taking those and placing them into a queenless nucleus colony that's overloaded with nurse bees. And those bees are going to raise a bunch of those queens. So the nurses are taking care of those queens and raising them, and then you basically are able to take out those bars of grafted cells and have several queens raised in a hive versus just 1 or 2 when you're making a split. And we'll talk about other ways that you can do this and achieve this on a small scale for queen rearing, and I will refer back to what grafting is and grafting calendars, because even when I'm using splits for management or Miller method or the cloak board for raising queens, I still use a lot of the prompts from the grafting calendar. So you'll hear me say that word grafting a few times today. I just wanted to make sure we all knew what that was and what I was doing. Okay, so for making strong queens, I think it is vital and important, and I'm probably going to say this several times today, that you choose queens who demonstrate hardy and productive characteristics, and who are resilient with minimal input. What do I mean by resilient with minimal input? I mean that the queens that you are raising, you didn't have to put several treatments on that hive, feed it 6 times throughout the year, and try to shuffle it along by adding brood from another hive, right? You want that queen that, as Ed said earlier, when you open the box, there's just bees pouring out of the box, and then you move that box and there's more bees pouring out of the box below it. Those are the queens that you want to be breeding from. And you still want to do mite counts on those queens and make sure that your mite counts are low. And you don't want to be breeding from that queen that you've been shuffling and pushing along for 2 years to try to keep her alive and just add a little bit more and maybe she'll be okay and so I'll try to breed or split from her. That's not going to get you healthy bees. So the 2 things you need to start with are a healthy queen, and then we'll talk later about the importance of both queen and brood nutrition to be able to raise a healthy queen, because that is also crucially important. All right, fun little test. Find the queen. Oh, whoops. These are Bob Brockman's queens. He runs Cold County, I think they're called, in New York State. They're beautiful. I absolutely love them. So marked versus unmarked queens. A little bit of a soapbox here, and then I'll also admit that I don't always do this. So something that I really took away from, I've taken away from several conversations with Dan and working with him a little bit in his queen rearing class last year, is that he marks all of his queens, okay? And the reason that he marks all of his queens isn't necessarily for ease of finding, but so that he can track those queens throughout the years, and so that he knows that those queens are the original queen, right? So he marks these queens so that they are trackable and so that he can tell if a queen has swarmed or not swarmed. I love this idea in principle. In practice, it's like not always the easiest thing to keep consistently up with. It does get you very good at grabbing bees by the wings. So you will get very good at that. So marked versus unmarked queens, I think, is like a little bit of a personal choice. I think it's important, especially if you're starting out in queen rearing, and if you are a person as a beekeeper who is not so good at keeping track of your swarm management, either because you have a lot of other things going on in your life, or because you don't have a strong understanding of that bee math and you're not keeping track of the overflow of some of your hives. If those 2 things are true of you, then I highly recommend that you make the time to mark your queens so that you can keep track of your lines. Because you don't want to make the assumption that this queen in this hive is doing really well and so you should breed from her, and actually it's her daughter and she was poorly mated in your yard, right? So that's how you can make a decision about, you can make informed decisions about your breeder queens. All right, find the queen. These are easy. They're going to get harder as we go along. All right, yeah, she is dead center. That's another one of Bob Brockman's queens. Marking queens also makes it a lot easier to find queens when you're ready to make splits or when you are thinking about queen breeding, because you do have to be able to take your queen out of the hive to do some breeding. So I do recommend it, and again, we'll also admit that it's not always common practice for me. Okay, so the other soapbox I will get on today and reiterate over and over and over again is that nutrition absolutely matters. If you ate potato chips and drank soda every single day, you probably feel pretty bad, right? So nutrition absolutely matters for our bees. And when I say nutrition, I don't just mean that they need to be fed or that they need to have nectar, but that they need to have pollen. Pollen is mixed with nectar to create bee bread, and that is what is fed to our nurse bees. And it is what our nurse bees take and distribute to our brood so that they can be reared. When we think about rearing queens requires that we have dry pollen. So queens do not eat the same thing as our workers. They eat lots of royal jelly, and they also need that dry pollen early on to be healthy. Pollen is the lipids, the minerals, and the protein of our honeybees. And so it's vital that we have pollen. I'm going to get deep into nutrition based on a workshop I went to with Heather Matilla a little bit later. And we'll get really nerdy about nutrition then, but I just want to touch on this right now. Pollen is absolutely vital to being able to rear queens, and not just that shiny bee bread pollen, but this drier pollen. So if we look at this frame of pollen right now, this stuff that looks a little bit shinier, That's bee bread, so that's already started fermenting. Up here in this corner, we have this drier, sort of flatter pollen. That's new and fresh, and that is the stuff that queens need. So when we are making up splits to make queens, we have to make sure that there is some of that pollen close to the open brood so that our nurse bees can get it to the new queen cells that they are going to rear. So pollen, protein, lipids, and minerals, absolutely vital for all bees and especially for raising queens. And then we have our nectar, which is our carbohydrate, right? So we have our protein, which is like for us would be eggs or meats or certain veggies and beans. And then we have our carbohydrates, which would be our like rices and french fries and things of that nature. Oh, french fries. Okay. So the reason that I talk about this is we can't have one without the other. We absolutely need to have both the protein and the carbohydrate. Think about what it would be like if you could only eat bread, right? You would also feel very bad. It's really important to have both of these, and it's important to feed your bees in New England. I'm not going to discount that. There was a while where I was anti-feeding bees any kind of sugar, but it's pretty hard to get through the year without feeding your bees at some point. But you can't rely on that sugar syrup to feed your bees all of the time, because if you do that, what you're doing is you're feeding your bees like a soda when they should be drinking like a water, okay? Because that sugar syrup has a higher acidity, which means that it's not as easily digestible as our nectar. So it's really important that our bees have access to both of these things. Supplemental feeding is sometimes necessary in all parts of the world, but we have to make sure our bees have good access to this. And I think that the importance of touching upon this is that when we are making splits, we need to know the pollen that's coming in, the nectar that's coming in, and have an understanding of that. Because if we don't, we're going to be making too many splits, or we're going to be dividing things up in a way that's not sustainable for our apiary. Okay. So let's go on to sources of feed. So we all know dandelion is one of our first main flows here in New England. And pretty much from the time that the dandelion starts until the time that the basswood flows is our prime queen rearing season. So you can raise queens a little bit before this if you push feed your bees, but really prime queen rearing season is when there's an abundance of nectar coming in and there's an abundance of pollen available. There's a little sort of burst in the fall, which is actually August, where we get our goldenrod and knotweed, which beekeepers love and gardeners hate, right? Yep. And we can raise queens during that time successfully, but it really depends on the year. So a couple of years ago, we had that nasty drought, and during that drought, we had the crummiest goldenrod flow and the crummiest knotweed flow that I've ever seen, and it was really hard to raise queens during that time. So don't just assume that because the flowers are out, the nectar is out. You also have to have an understanding of what the temperatures are and what the water situation is, or the availability and bioavailability of water is. So if you don't have water, the nectar cannot flow up to the flowers and flow out of the plant. Instead, it stays down in the roots of the plant and is used as feed down there. And then the same goes for temperature, which we typically find more in New England early in the year. So what happens is we get our, oh, hold on, I just had a space out. We get our black locusts, right? And it comes up and it flowers and it's looking beautiful and we're like, great, black locust flow is on. But then the temperature drops down to 50 degrees because, I don't know, why do we live here? The temperature drops down to like 55 degrees and the nectar is not going to be flowing in that black locust because the sugars are going to draw back into the plant. So it's important that we don't just make the assumption, oh, the flowers are out, we're good to go. We have to also be looking inside of our hive, looking for that nectar coming in, and we have to be a little bit like botanists, thinking about the conditions that the plant is flowering in and how those conditions are going to impact our hive. So I say that bees are a complex biological system, but then we also have to have an understanding of the ecosystem in which the bees live in order to understand our bees. So we're thinking about a complex system nested within another complex system. And we're going to get deep into this later, but I just wanted to show us our queen cells and what those look like. So healthy queen cells, there they are, have a generous amount of royal jelly as their epicenter. And I'm going to show you the difference between really well-fed queen cells and queen cells that are just kind of well-fed. And we're going to see that size differential in there. But in the inside, if you're looking at an uncapped queen cell, you want to see a lot of royal jelly at the bottom. And if you're looking at a cell that is, so these are capped, if you're looking at a cell that isn't yet capped, what you're going to see is that your larva is just floating in that, okay? And that is going to be the food that your queen relies on when she's inside of the cell. Once that's sealed over, that's going to be the only food that she has access to. So you want to make sure that she has access to an abundance of this royal jelly. And the way that we do that is making sure that our splits or our queen rearing conditions are well nourished so that they are able to grow up into beautiful, healthy queens. The other thing that you absolutely need when you are raising queens is generous nectar and pollen production. So this is going to make sure that you have the nutrition for all stages of your larval development. So we're not just thinking about, does the queen have enough food, but if the nurse bees in the hives that you took your nurse bees from to make up your queen rearing colony didn't have enough food, they aren't going to do a good job of raising your queen, okay? So it's really vital that your nurse bees are also well nourished. And so that means sometimes you're going to have to feed, sometimes you're going to have to add pollen supplement if you're a person that's thinking about rearing some queens. Because if your nurse bees don't have enough food, they end up moving from the nurse bee stage to the forager stage too soon, which means that they are not going to be taking care of your queen properly, which then means your queen doesn't have enough food, and then we get into a vicious cycle of malnourishment. Okay. Just a quick review of different jobs. So our nurse bees, while they are building wax, they are also the primary caretakers of both our larva and our queen cells. So nurse bees are absolutely vital to making sure that your hives are raised well. And then we have our drone. So the drone, as we all know, his one job in the world is to
eat and mate.
Fertilize, mate. He's supposed to have sex. I like saying the word sex in a group of New Englanders. I think it's important for us to do it. I know. So his one job is to mate, right? And why is it important that that we have our drones? We have to have our drones so that they can mate with the queens that we're raising, right? So we can have the most well-nourished nurse bees, the most well-nourished queen cells, but if we don't have those sexually mature drones, we've basically just done one side of the problem, right? So we have to think about the other side, which is the presence of this drone brood, and making sure that that is plentiful. A rule of thumb that I heard from Kirk last year was your hives that are going to be your drone mating hives, the hives that are going to mate with your queen, you want those to have about 25% drone brood in them. And some people will add drone brood, if there's drone comb, if there's not enough drone comb being drawn out, and some people just will rely on or move drone comb from other hives. So this is sort of the opposite of something that we'll talk about a little bit, drone comb removal as a management strategy. This is actually, it's important when you're raising queens that you have the drone comb available. If you take the drones out, then you're not going to have anyone to mate with your queens. This is just a series of ways that we can count mites. So again, sticky boards, which go into the bottom of your hive, are great. The sugar roll I don't recommend, but I did put a video in here, and then the alcohol wash, which is the standard way that I do it. And the reason that I put this in is I'm going to send y'all all of these presentations. And so if you need a review or you want to check out one of these YouTube videos, these are really detailed ways to do each of these methods. And so I appreciate them, and I keep them in my presentation so everybody knows how to do what. So swarming, this is my swarm poster that I made in collaboration with an artist last year. So swarming is our colony's natural reproductive cycle, right? When we are creating a hive that's got an abundance of nurse bees, that has all of the conditions necessary to raise several queen cells, we are basically mimicking a really healthy swarm response, okay? And swarm response is when the bees are ready to swarm, they increase the amount of nutrition that they are feeding their young, and they increase the amount of nutrition that they're feeding those queen cells. And so they are creating all of the proper conditions to mate and make a successful daughter colony so that they can, half of that hive can leave, the other half could stay and raise that new queen. And so when we are trying to mimic that and use the swarm response to our advantage when we're raising queens, we're really trying to create all the conditions of a swarm. So that's important to hold in our minds. We want to have those abundant nurse bees. We want to have all of the right nutritional availability. So that means nectar and pollen. And we want to have the conditions by which our bees can raise queens. Let's see, does this actually work?
We would ask questions now, or should we wait?
I am going to wrap up in one more slide, and then we can bang out some questions. Yeah. So this is just a little vid of some bees that are swarming, just to give us a sense of a big, healthy swarm. Actually, I don't know if we'll actually see her. So when we see a swarm response, we see all of these bees up in the air before they land or alight onto either a tree branch or a car or anything that's still enough for them to rest upon. And we see this abundance of bees. And the reason I wanted to put this in is because I really want to highlight that when you're raising queens, you need to have this abundance of bees that are inside of that queen rearing colony, because that is what's going on when you have a swarm response. If you have any of you opened a hive and you find queen cells, and the thing that you notice first before you even get deep enough to find queen cells is that that hive is just spilling over with bees, and they're just coming out and they are everywhere. That is the kind of structure that you want to create when you are trying to rear your own queens. So just to highlight that for our last little piece, and then we will go on to questions. Yeah.
So I have a question about the swarm, and I think it's because we're new beekeepers, but it seems like videos I've watched and things I've learned in the beekeeping class is that when you see the hive building the queen cells, that you should actually get rid of, because you don't want them to swarm. And I've actually seen people scrape off the queen cells because you don't want to swarm. So I feel like a little wary of the bees swarming, and is that good for a new beekeeper to not have them swarm? That's my question.
So swarm management, there's like a lot of different schools of thought about swarm management, and I think my answer to this question is scraping cells is a temporary solution to swarm response, right? So if I go in and I see queen cells that have an egg in them and are being developed, and I say that because Russian bees make queen cups like it's going out of style, right? Like they are like, put a queen cup over here, 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 and then they tear them all down. But what you want to make sure is, are those queen cups full of an egg? Do they have royal jelly in them? Are they getting ready to raise a queen? So in that case, I think it depends what your objective is, right? Because all you're doing when you scrape out a queen cell is you're giving yourself another week or two before you have to go back in and scrape out more queen cells. And so what ends up happening is you're just sort of band-aiding what your hive wants to do anyway. And actually, in order to manage for a swarm, you have to make sure that you're front-loading your management in the springtime. So when you install your bees, or if you have an overwintered colony, you need to make sure consistently throughout the spring that that hive has enough space in it to build up into a healthy hive. rather than waiting until you see queen cells and then scraping those out, right? Because now what you're doing is you're taking a hive that is healthy, active, ready to reproduce, wants to make itself another queen, and you're just like stifling that health. And it causes stress because the bees know what they want to do. They know how they want to perform, and you just scraping out those cells is infuriating to the system of management that they are initiating, right? So scraping queen cells does not solve swarming. It actually, in my opinion, creates a stressful situation for your bees. However, if I am waiting for my hives to build up this like abundance so I can split them into a bunch of even splits, and I go in when I'm ready to, after this hive has been built up in abundance, and I know I'm going to be taking out my queen, and I find queen cells anyway, then I may just scrape those queen cells out and make a bunch of splits and add the queens that I want to have. So this is where it gets into what I want and what my system of management is and how I'm responding, right? So rather than, oh, I go in and I find that I've been pushing this hive to the brink so that it really builds up, and I do find queen cells, I'm not going to make a bunch of splits of that and let them raise those queen cells. I'm going to give them the queen cells that I want them to raise, right? So it's sort of a difference of your management versus their management. But as a new beekeeper, I think the better response to your question is that you have to be thinking about swarms way before they happen. And you have to be looking at your hive and using that bee math that I gave to assume, okay, so I installed my 5-frame nucleus colony. That's got, let's say this is the most awesome nucleus colony ever, and it has 5 full frames of capped brood, right? That means that in a few days, I'm going to have 10 full frames of brood, of emerged bees that are ready to work, right? And they're going to be in nurse bee mode, which means they're going to be wanting to raise a bunch of young. And so I have to make sure that that box doesn't just have those 10 frames, but has an additional box on it. So when all those bees emerge and they're young nurse bees, they're ready to take care of the young and they're ready to build wax, I'm maximizing the amount of wax that they're able to build. And I'm maximizing the amount of young that they're able to raise. And then I'm making sure I'm giving them enough room to do all of those jobs. The swarm response starts when the bees feel like they've maxed out their space and that they have an abundance of resource coming in. And that's when they're like, all right, it's time to make some new plans, right? So you have to make sure that you're front-loading your management so that you're able to manage for those things and you don't get the swarm response triggered too early. Because that's when, and I've heard a couple of people in here say it, that they got their first year package or their first year nucleus colony and it was doing so good that it swarmed. Yes, it was doing good. But also somewhere in there, you made a management misstep and you weren't paying attention to what your bees needed. And now, instead of building up into a colony that can overwinter, they have swarmed and now you have lost half your bees. So it's really important to be front-loading that management for swarming and having a mentor who can help you do that work so that you're not getting to a point where you have this overpopulated hive and you're having to just scrape out queen cells, right? Because that's not a way to manage your bees. It's sort of a little bit negligent, and I'm not calling anyone out or accusing you of anything, but it's that you haven't been thinking about management until you got to a point where now you need to react, right? And we don't want to react to our bees. We want to respond to their needs rather than react to loss,
That was a
essentially.
brilliant response. I really understand it better because I was afraid of swarming.
Right, and we all are.
Yeah.
And I think as new beekeepers, what we tend to do is we get in, then we're like over in our hives and we're like over analyzing everything. But if you have a strong understanding of that, that basic bee math, okay, how many frames of brood do I have? And you're keeping a good record of it, then you can respond to that, right? And so if you go in and you take these notes, and maybe you didn't add that second box, but then when you go back to your house and you look at the notes that you took and you're like, oh, there's 5 frames of capped brood. So that means in a few days I'm going to have 10 frames of emerged bees. I need to go back and add a box, right? Then you can respond to that in a way that makes sense. So it's that part about record keeping and also about understanding what's happening inside your hive that's really crucial. And then there's that other piece of knowing when your nectar flows are and knowing when your pollen flows are coming in. That's also important.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Other questions? Yeah.
Just have a general question how the drones work within the hive. About a year or so, I was reading a book, and queen would fly out like 2.5 miles or so
Mm-hmm.
outside the hive, and it would be beyond the range of the drones that are in the hive.
Yep.
To get diversity of
Mhm.
the genetics and all. But you indicated, you want to make sure the sexually mature. It indicated that the ones in the hive would actually mate with the queen that would be flying out. Is
Oh,
that right?
yeah.
So
That's
I thought
confusing.
like my drones might go with bees from another hive in the general area
Mhm.
or something like that.
Mhm.
But the ones that, if a queen that was from my hive would be mated maybe from someone else from a different apiary
Yeah.
that's like several miles away.
Yeah,
Is
great
that-
question. So I didn't clarify that. Thanks for bringing that up. So when I was talking about drone colonies, I have my yards sited within 2 miles of each other. So I might be raising queens at 258 Greenfield Road in Montague, and then I am raising colonies that are for like honey and drone production. So I'm not mating from those in a hive or a yard like 2 miles away from that, right? And so essentially as a queen rearer, what I'm trying to do is actually get multiple yards where I have drones populating my area so that I'm saturating that area with the drones that I want to be mating with my bees to maximize those drones. Or I have all of those yards in an isolated place where I know there's no other beekeepers. You guys don't have that luxury here in Norfolk. We don't really have that luxury in Western Mass so much anymore. You kind of have to go like up to Vermont or upstate New York, like where there's just not a lot of people to have that kind of luxury. But yeah, so I don't mean that the drone comb would be in that same hive that I'm mating my queens from. I mean that would be in other hives within a 2-mile radius of my mating yard. And it's not to say, there is that adage that the queen will fly. She goes to what's called drone congregation areas, right? So she's flying to a place where there's drones that have populated and they're waiting for queens. And I still think that there are drones getting in there from your main yard, right? And that it's actually important to have those other yards so you're making sure that inbreeding, you're lowering the chance of that inbreeding. But the reality is that you don't know if those drones are coming from your home yard or from your yard 2 miles away because you don't have little like bee collars on each of them, tracking them and keeping track of them. But you try to make sure that you have wherever your queens are going to be reared from and then a separate yard where you're raising your drones and that those aren't coming from the same family. They have to be coming from a different cross or a different family. Great question. Thank you for asking that. Other questions? Cool. So what we are going to do now is take about a 15-minute break. It is 10:20. So if I could have you all back here by 10:35, that would be great.
Yeah.